All right. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Shiloh Brooks. I'm the Executive Director of the James Madison Program, and I just want to say what an honor it is to have you all here and also to be recognizing the work of Keith Whittington. I will just say to you, Keith, you probably don't know this, but I found Princeton in a way through you. My university president at the University of Colorado, I was coming to visit the James Madison Program to see what they were doing so that I could take those lessons back to the University of Colorado. And the president of the university called me in his office and told me he wanted me to come visit, and he handed me Keith Whittington's Speak Freely and said, read this before you go. And so you had made it all the way up to our administration. and I did read that book, and it came in very handy when our center fell into a crisis of free speech some years later. And we plastered, in fact, quotations from your book on our website to show why we ought not to be in trouble. So at any rate, thank you for saving my career, Keith. You didn't even know. But it's my honor to introduce Greg Conti, who is Assistant Professor of Politics here at Princeton and who will be heading up this panel. So Greg, please.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Shiloh. So I'm Greg Conti from the Politics Department. I'm very happy to chair this panel. Before we get going, I'll just share a quick word of my own. I've had the office neighboring Keith's for the last 5 years. And I can say that this arrangement has served me very well because Keith is quite soft-spoken and indeed seems to prefer to work from home. So I can't imagine a better person to share a wall with, and I'm very hopeful that he will not be replaced by someone more omnipresent and boisterous or anything like that. That would be a real tragedy for me. More seriously, I've read so much of Keith's work and admired it greatly. But even more than that, I'm grateful for the many informal conversations we've had in a bunch of different venues about freedom of speech and the condition of our universities over the past 6 years that I've been here. So I'll really miss Keith, and I think his departure will be a great loss to Princeton's intellectual life. Anyway, this is the panel on free speech and academic freedom, and we have 3 distinguished speakers, so I'll just be brief in introducing them and then get out of the way. First, we have Robert George, our own McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence in the Princeton Politics Department and the Director of the James Madison Program sponsoring this conference. Then we'll hear from Jonathan Marks, Professor of Political Philosophy at Ursinus College. And finally, David Rabban, who is the Dahr Jamail, Randall Hage Jamail, and Robert Lee Jamail, I hope I pronounced those right, Regents Chair at the University of Texas School of Law, and also a university distinguished teaching professor. So without further ado, Robbie, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, and this is another opportunity for me to say just how honored I am to have been able to work with Keith for 25 years. He was my closest disciplinary colleague here and my co-conspirator on some important projects especially relating to the subject matter of this particular panel, freedom of speech. I conceive our mission as teachers at liberal arts institutions. Those of you who are in vocational education, I'm not sure if this would apply quite so much, but for those of us who are liberal arts teachers, I see our mission, the teaching part of our mission, as one of forming the young men and women in our charge, entrusted to us, to be determined truth seekers, courageous truth speakers, and lifelong learners. To do that, we have to preach a bit. We have to use words. We have to exhort, seek the truth. If you think you've got the truth or a piece of the truth or getting near the truth, speak your mind, even when it's unpopular, even when it's risky. And don't stop learning. Don't think you've got it perfectly or got it all or necessarily got it right. Keep learning. So we have to exhort. That's part of our job. But we also have to teach by example. And I think our modeling those virtues, those qualities, is even more important. It can't replace the words, it can't replace the exhortation, but it's even more important than the words and exhortation. And there, Keith has been absolutely exemplary. It's hard to think of a person who is a more determined and dedicated truth seeker, a more courageous truth speaker, even when what he's got to say is going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, or someone who's more dedicated to learning. Now, this concept of truth is really central to Keith's work, both theoretical and practical, on freedom of speech. Why do we need freedom of speech, especially in universities, but also in the general domain of public affairs, especially in a democratic republic? Why? What's a complex answer to that question? But a central part of that complex answer is to get at the truth of things as best we can. When I arrived myself at Princeton, Keith's been here 25 years. He seems like an old timer. I've been here nearly 40. When I arrived right out of graduate school back in the Middle Ages, fall of 1985, it was considered a mark of sophistication to be skeptical, or at least to express skepticism about truth. And behind that skepticism, or those expressions of skepticism, to the extent that they were more than simply performative, was, I think, a legitimate concern, and that was a concern about dogmatism. If someone believes in truth, the reasoning went, then they're likely to think sometimes that they've got it. And if they think they've got it, they're likely then to want to act on it, and perhaps act on it in ways that deprive other people of freedom. Now, it's a legitimate concern. But of course, we should only be concerned at all if there's some truth of the matter. If in fact, there are truths that we should protect against dogmatism. If it's true that we should not be dogmatists. So there's a retorsive problem with the denial of the possibility of truth, although there are sophisticated works in philosophy, such as the work of Peter Unger, to defend the idea that you can survive, that the argument for skepticism, for truly radical skepticism, can survive a retorsive critique. But I introduce this for this reason. That was then, this is now. One of the things that strikes me as among the very largest changes I've seen in my now nearly 40 years in academic life is that one rarely hears those kinds of expressions of skepticism these days. Rather, one hears very, very firm affirmations of what people hold as true. But often those affirmations are dogmatic, the very concern that the old skeptics had in mind. I think we've moved from a situation where skepticism was the problem to a situation where dogmatism is the problem. There seem to be people in academic life who don't think that it's legitimate to question certain things because we know they're true, and if you deny them, then you must be a bad person. You must be a fool or a fraud. You must be a bigot or an elitist, or you must be something. There must be something wrong with you. So in some ways, I find myself longing for the good old days of moral relativism and skepticism. I'd rather have them than the absolutism and dogmatism we have today. And here's where Keith's work comes in. What's the key to solving that problem? Is there a way to avoid both skepticism, which undermines the very idea that we should be in the business of pursuing truth, the very idea that we should be in the business of academic life? Is there a position between that skepticism and the dogmatism and absolutism, which I think is doing great harm to academic life as a truth-seeking vocation today? Keith again exemplifies the answer. It's to firmly affirm the idea of truth, so firmly that one's willing to go after it, so firmly that one is willing to dedicate one's life to seeking it, so firmly that one is willing to be courageous and take risks and take the slings and arrows that come from speaking your mind when what you have to say isn't in line with whatever the dominant orthodoxy is. But at the same time, to recognize, here comes the key concepts, fallibility, human fallibility, one's own fallibility, and not just notionally in the sense that I would check the right box on a true-false test where the question is, are you fallible or not? But where you actually existentially understand yourself to be fallible, understand that you can be wrong not simply about the trivial, superficial, minor things in life, but even about the big, profound, important things, the basic questions of meaning and value, of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny, human rights. You can be wrong about those things. Some of the greatest figures of history have been wrong about those things. Some of the most brilliant people in history have been wrong on matters of that level. To recognize, therefore, that I could be wrong, and then, next key concept, when one truly recognizes, not just notionally, truly recognizes one's own fallibility, then one will come to develop the virtue of intellectual humility, without which the truth-seeking process is dead. And it's that virtue that is the guardrail against dogmatism. And you see it throughout Keith's work, and you see it formally defended in Keith's work. So if we look at Keith's work really on normative questions of free speech, where the Constitution doesn't apply, where we're not even talking about the Constitution. For example, in private universities like here at Princeton, we look at Keith's work. It's all dedicated to defending free speech, not as an end in itself, but as a necessary condition for the pursuit of truth, the very telos, the very end or goal, aim of this enterprise of academic life. It's that we're after, but that can only be pursued well where different ideas are entertained, where conflicting ideas can genuinely be engaged, where people are sufficiently intellectually humble to be willing to entertain criticism, not simply to refrain from shutting it down, not simply to stand quietly and let the other guy talk, although you may be, thinking about what you're going to have for dinner tonight or what you're going to do over the weekend and not really listening to the guy, just out of politesse, and then letting the other guy talk. Too often, civility, as in the concept of civil discourse, is reduced to a mere matter of politesse. That's not what civility is. Civility is not just politesse. It's not just listening politely or not interrupting. It means genuinely listening in a truth-seeking spirit. Sandy will recall, if no one else does, the old guys like Sandy and me will recall, we don't remember him, but we recall Learned Hand's famous statement, right, that the spirit of liberty is a spirit of not being too sure you're right. When I first heard that in law school, I mistakenly assumed that Hand must be embracing some sort of moral skepticism or relativism. But of course, that wasn't it at all. Rather, he was stressing the importance of intellectual humility in light of an acceptance, a knowledge, an understanding of human fallibility. Without it, you do fall into dogmatism. Without it, you destroy the conditions of truth-seeking. And Keith has defended these matters, these virtues, defended free speech, not simply as a theoretical matter, but as I say, as a practical matter. In 2015, Princeton became the second university after the University of Chicago itself to adopt the University of Chicago free speech principles, those robust principles that prevent any viewpoint-based restrictions on speech, that protect professors and students and staff members here at Princeton or at the University of Chicago from any disciplinary proceedings based on a viewpoint-based prohibition of certain kinds of speech. Who was in the forefront of that fight? Keith Whittington. Why? because Keith recognized the importance of robust free speech to the pursuing of our mission as a university and our vocation as scholars and teachers. Keith's work helped make us the first university to adopt the University of Chicago free speech principles by a faculty vote, as opposed to having, as what happened at Chicago, having the Board of Trustees adopt the principles. I'm really proud of that, and Keith has every reason to be proud of that himself because Keith was instrumental in doing it. His book, Speaking Freely, had a profound impact around the nation in promoting genuine, robust free speech at colleges and universities. None more than here at Princeton, where his book was assigned as the freshman pre-read the year that it came out. So all of our freshmen were directed by the president of the university himself, President Eisgruber, another distinguished constitutional scholar, to read the book. It was the common reading for that year, and it was the basis of countless important, valuable discussions of free speech on our campus. And then, in 1920 and 1921, Keith was instrumental in co-founding the Academic Freedom Alliance to bring together scholars across the ideological spectrum, left to right, center, unclassifiable, from private universities, public universities, religiously affiliated universities, non-sectarian universities, to make a commitment to standing up for each other's free speech rights, whether or not one agreed with the speech. When we think of Keith, I think, rightly, we don't think of him primarily as an activist. If you were putting together a list of activist scholars, you wouldn't put Keith Whittington on the list. But Keith's practical work, dare I call it activism, has made a real difference for the cause of free speech here at Princeton and throughout the country. And for that, I want to salute him and thank him and tell him yet again, he's always welcome back here. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank the Madison Center for putting this together after weeks of fretting about encampments. It's good to come together to celebrate this amiable decamper, Keith Whittington. Keith is, to riff a little bit off of what Robbie George just said, my kind of scholar activist. The motto of the organization that he helped found, the Academic Freedom Alliance, is solidarity in pursuit of truth. And solidarity, usually when deployed in an academic context, makes me a little itchy. But as deployed in that motto, I think that it has the potential to inoculate the user against some bad tendencies that even good advocacy organizations have at times, to overinterpret data in order to magnify the scope of a problem, to think that the law and the principles are always unambiguously on your side, to suppose that your adversaries have nothing going for them apart from the energy of malice. To this kind of advocate, Keith is kind of a wet blanket. Yes, our free speech academic situation is worrying, but alas, it's not apocalyptic. Academic jurisprudence might be a help in some way, but it's underdeveloped and in need of refinement and can go a lot of different ways. And our adversaries may be wrong, but not altogether wrong. So to correct myself, going along with Robbie George, Keith isn't exactly a scholar activist in the sense that his scholarship is dedicated to activism, but he's drawn into activism to defend the work of real universities. So let's talk a little bit about real universities. One of the most important aspects of Keith's treatment of free speech on campus, whether he's talking about it philosophically or whether he's talking about it from a legal perspective, is this idea of the real university, what the AAUP calls in its 1915 Statement of Principles in Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, ordinary institutions of learning. And what these institutions of learning, real universities, try to do is to advance knowledge, I'm quoting from the statement, by the unrestricted research and unfettered discussion of impartial investigators, as opposed to proprietary institutions which transmit doctrines. If private and public employers are expected to honor the free speech of professors more than they honor the free speech of salespeople or policemen, that has to do with the function universities fulfill. But that raises some questions, a couple of which I'll ask, because even though I think I fall roughly where Keith does regarding almost every free speech on campus issue, these questions nonetheless bug me. So first, consider Keith's argument regarding the extramural speech of state university professors, their speech as citizens. Keith allows that public employers have a strong interest in preserving their reputation with the public, and that this interest might be especially strong for government agencies engaged in peacekeeping or acting in loco parentis. But he argues, because the university's brand is considering controversial ideas, it doesn't make sense long-term to shut down controversial speech in order to protect the brand. So if you're weighing a professor's rights to speak about matters of public concern against the university's right to protect its reputation against the effects of controversial speech, the university's right doesn't weigh much in that balance. But there's another aspect of the university's brand described in the 1915 statement, which makes impartiality part of that brand. Impartiality is part of the university's brand, and the effectiveness of the university does depend, the authors of that statement suggest, in scholars being perceived as governed by scientific conscience rather than by intemperate partisanship. The 1915 statement, nonetheless, seemingly because its authors regarded the political involvement of professors as potentially a most marvelous gift to democracy, don't put a lot of restrictions on extramural speech, and the ones they do have largely fallen away as the statement, or whether the subsequent 1940 statement has been interpreted over the years. Yet other institutions for whom impartiality is a brand are more mindful of the importance of such restrictions for preserving the brand. For example, my wife is a judicial law clerk. My notes here say to pause for applause. She's required to adhere to a code of conduct, which includes this injunction: avoid partisan and nonpartisan political activity, which includes putting political bumper stickers on her car. So if she wishes to communicate a political message, she has to do it through coded "I love Labradors" bumper stickers. The ethics of political journalists counsel against making political donations or even signing petitions. Professional journalists in the news and opinion sections of the New York Times may not wear campaign buttons or themselves display any other insignias of partisan politics. Now, that's not because anybody thinks that it's impossible for a clerk or a judge or a journalist to act impartially at work while being a spittle-flecked partisan on Twitter. That's not it. But the capacity of courts and papers that aspire to neutrality to function well depends on reputation enough that one builds a fence around propriety by avoiding even the appearance of impropriety. That's the idea anyway. In comparison, at universities, professors engaged in the study of Middle East, along with professors who know more about the Middle East than their neighbor Phil, feel free to sign their names to rabidly partisan petitions. There are good reasons which Keith lays out and may lay out again about being very wary about restraining extramural speech. But doesn't the university, just like the police, have legitimate branding concerns after all? And why wouldn't that counsel some restraint on extramural speech beyond harassment, true threats, and all the rest? Second, Keith concedes that ideas about free speech and academic freedom best fit research universities, which the 1915 statement does seem to have in mind as the model of a real university. And he also concedes that universities have had and do have lots of other purposes. And although the research university has enjoyed extraordinary success, the aim of having an organization devoted completely to the untrammeled pursuit of knowledge was aspirational and arguably never took. James Angell, president of the University of Michigan, in his 1871 inaugural address, argued on the one hand that the university should be non-sectarian and required a degree of independence, and that teachers needed intellectual freedom. And on the other, that teachers should be selected for the task of preparing their pupils for manly and womanly work and promoting our Christian civilization. Today, Andrew Delbanco, in his book College, distinguishes between colleges, I work at one, and universities, in part on the basis of the character-forming aspirations of the former, including turning students, in Delbanco's view, from sheer self-interest toward a life of enlarged sympathy. Martha Nussbaum sees the humanities as part Socratic on the one hand, but also part a rally of troops in an ongoing worldwide struggle between greed and narcissism on the one hand, and respect and love on the other. And in between Angell and our contemporaries, the authors of the 1945 Harvard Report, General Education of Free Society, argued not only that such education was a teacher of the strictest regard for the claims of evidence, but also an engine of peacetime mobilization, the moral equivalent of war. They were mindful that the university shouldn't be a church or moral reformatory, but nonetheless gave the university a role of transmitting a belief in the dignity and mutual obligation of man. In short, at American universities, Socrates has always sat in uneasy alliance with Jesus and his secular successors. Now take this duality of aim, moralistic, scientific, and add to other aims that Keith acknowledges, job training, winning the Rose Bowl, and that kind of thing, and you have a confused mission. Even if what universities call critical thinking remains somehow central to that mission, if the way we think about academic freedom is related to the function of universities, how do we deal with the fact that the university has historically served a multitude of functions, perhaps only one of which pushes very hard in the direction of academic freedom? Keith has said in a lot of ways that First Amendment jurisprudence with respect to academic freedom at public universities depends on the kind of thing a public university is. And if that were to change, right, the perspective of First Amendment jurisprudence on them might have to change, but in a sense you might argue that they're already changed or didn't need to change, again, in order to be a very confused mix of things. Relatedly, since I'm told that Keith is moving to a professional school of some sort, I wonder if he thinks if academic freedom being connected to the function of an institution, whether it changes at all when you're sitting in that context, as compared to the context of a simple university.
Well, like others, I'm delighted to participate in this conference. It gives me an opportunity to celebrate with the rest of you Keith's scholarship. And selfishly, it's also provided me the occasion to reread Keith's writings on free speech and academic freedom and to consider them as a whole. I think Keith turned to this subject of free speech and academic freedom relatively recently, after an impressive, prolific career writing about other topics, as we've already heard this morning. And I think this turn to a new subject in mid-career is itself very impressive. Many excellent scholars tend to spend their entire careers focused on the same issues, and Keith could easily have continued to contribute at a very high level to fields that he had already pursued. But Keith didn't just turn to a new field. I think he recognized how important the issue at free speech at universities had become, and that it was likely to become even more important in the near future. Yet while Keith was prescient about this, I don't think even he could have imagined the widespread attention to this issue in the last year or two. Who could have, really, right? And this new attention, of course, has been provoked, I think, particularly by what has been called anti-woke legislation directed at critical legal studies and other subjects, and by the reaction on American campuses to the conflict in Gaza in the wake of the Hamas attacks of October 7th. I believe that Keith's book, to which many have referred, Speak Freely, Why American Universities Must Defend Free Speech, published in 2018, was his first major publication on the subject of free speech in American universities. And I remember that Keith asked me to read a late draft of this book in the spring of 2017, when I had a fellowship here at the LAPA program at Princeton. And I remember being extremely impressed by both the ambition and the clarity of the draft, which addressed fundamental issues in ways that were accessible, I thought, to a general audience, not just to academics. And I remember a very stimulating lunch with Keith discussing his draft during that spring. And in the few minutes I have here, I'd like to highlight the major themes of this book and also talk a little about how Keith's subsequent scholarship complements and extends these themes. I also want to stress what Robbie referred to, which was Keith's work in founding and leading the Academic Freedom Alliance, which took an extraordinary amount of time and required, which Keith had, great diplomatic skills. I think Dahr referred to that earlier, in bringing together effectively people with very, very different views on all kinds of issues, but who were committed to the principles of free speech and academic freedom. And I would say, unlike the work of the commission, evidently, which may not have been that effective, in my view, I mean, I have an interest because I've been involved, but I do think that the work of the Academic Freedom Alliance has produced real results for people who would have been fired or disciplined but for the intervention of the organization that Keith led in putting together. So that is a major achievement that complements his scholarly work on free speech. So as Keith emphasizes in Speak Freely, he did not focus on legal arguments in that book. I think Robbie adverted to that earlier. Rather, he explored more fundamental justifications connecting free speech to the central mission or functions, as Jonathan was saying, of the university. And I think this turn to fundamentals was a major advance from the much narrower issues being addressed both in the legal and the general literature about free speech and academic freedom. Keith stressed that the central mission of the university is to produce and disseminate knowledge, that this mission requires free inquiry, and that academic freedom protects free inquiry, which Keith describes as an atmosphere, quoting him now, in which no beliefs are sacred, no ideas are safe from scrutiny, and no opinions are immune from criticism. Before exploring the issue of free speech on campus, Keith, in his book, draws on two central strands of thought that underline the critical importance of speech in universities. The first strand is the Jeffersonian advocacy of democratic dissent, which warned against giving any official the power to suppress or punish controversial thought. And the second strand is the liberal tradition associated especially with John Stuart Mill and especially with his book on liberty. And this strand emphasizes that we can be confident of our own views only if we subject them to the scrutiny and attack by others, a theme that Robbie was emphasizing. Keith then spends most of the book applying these two major strands to a wide variety of free speech issues on campus, including, and this is 2018, he saw these issues of trigger warnings and safe spaces, hate speech, various forms of protest, whether they should or shouldn't be protected, how to deal with outside speakers, and how to treat academic freedom as a specialized application of general free speech principles differentiated from issues dealing with public speech. Keith also stressed the importance of ideological diversity on university campuses, a theme he's extended in more recent essays. Since publishing Speak Freely in 2018, Keith has written extensively about free speech and academic freedom, publishing many important articles at his typically prolific rate, and as people have mentioned this year, publishing another book. And I want to highlight two articles Keith published last year, 2023, which, unlike in Speak Freely, did address the application of First Amendment law to free speech and academic freedom on campus. One article dealt with legislative restrictions on campus speech, and the other dealt with the issue Jonathan was talking about, the extramural public speech of professors. Now, I don't have time in this short overview to delve into the positions that Keith takes on these important issues he identified. I hope we'll have time to discuss these issues in the discussion that's about to follow. But I do want to pose one question raised by Keith's recent articles. While Keith thinks, correctly in my view, that there is extraordinary confusion and flawed reasoning in current First Amendment law dealing with free speech and academic freedom on campus, I have the impression that he thinks it is possible to reconcile, and Keith himself emphasized this morning that that's part of what he likes to do, to reconcile different strains. I think Keith believes that it is possible to reconcile the First Amendment protection for academic freedom with the general First Amendment analysis of speech by public employees, which focuses on whether speech is about a matter of public concern, on balancing employee interests in free speech with employer interests in workplace efficiency, and on whether speech by an employee is made pursuant to official duties. And I'm curious to hear from Keith, as I close, whether my impression is correct, that he thinks it's possible to reconcile these different strands. And I'm particularly interested because I don't think such reconciliation is possible. So I'd like to hear his views if he thinks it is. So thank you, Keith.
Oh, I see you've already got the mic there, Keith. So do you want to, yeah, okay.
So thanks again. Really appreciate it. And this has been a great panel. I regret that I can't guarantee, Greg, that the office will remain quiet, as quiet going forward as it has been. I'm glad I've been able to bring you peace and quiet. It's an important goal. And I wish I had not had to write much about free speech. It's free speech as a general matter has been of longstanding interest and concern of mine, and as a consequence was something in which I had some resources to draw upon in thinking about more recently. But I didn't think it was ever something that I had anything professionally interesting to say about, and maybe many would say I still don't have anything professionally interesting to say about, but it felt like increasingly it was something that I needed to engage in, and felt pressure to focus on this issue because it was central, at least in this little narrow area of free speech that I have mostly spent my time thinking about, which is the specific context of campuses and faculty and student speech more generally in that particular environment. That unfortunately, in current circumstances, it just feels like universities are under just extraordinary pressures in which those of us who are well positioned to try to speak out in defense of universities and what we try to do on university campuses, and also try to articulate what those practices and principles ought to be that ought to be guiding us on university campuses, really have some responsibility to do what we can to try to shore these institutions up and leave them in at least as good a shape for future generations as we found them in the first place. And as a consequence, I felt obliged to spend some time doing this. As is often the case, I think, with anything you write, I find that you start writing something and next thing you know, you get drawn in to areas. And that's been somewhat true here, where it might imagine Speak Freely was going to be a one-off, except that the issue continues, but also you get pulled in on these matters. It also turns out, I think, that there are lots of fascinating conceptual scholarly issues to explore relating to campus speech issues and academic freedom issues. And so it's been something that once I at least found myself thinking about, it turns out there are lots of interesting things to think about. And so things to explore. And I've been appreciative to very much of the people on this panel, as well as colleagues elsewhere, who have helped me hopefully not embarrass myself as I've tried to explore this new area, and have really helped push my thinking forward on these issues over time. I especially also appreciate these particular colleagues, as well as, again, colleagues elsewhere, about the work on the Academic Freedom Alliance, which perhaps less conceptually interesting, but terribly important, I think, in terms of the kind of work it did, and has been intriguing about sort of really pushing me to think more carefully about very practical problems associated with academic freedom and free speech, and how to try to grapple with them in ways I might not have otherwise encountered, forced me to try to engage in kind of academic politics I've always tried to avoid. And so, for better or for worse, found myself having to do things that I really prefer not to be doing. And certainly took a lot of time and energy, but I think it's time and energy that was well spent and needed to be spent. So I was grateful and glad to have been doing it, and hope to continue doing it as long as the fight needs to be fought, and can still have some possibility of being won. And so in that sense, I have to be optimistic about our situation, to think that's still worth fighting for and spending time and energy on in general. So I think there are many things to continue working on in this area. There's certainly lots of work to continue doing. I think a lot of that work is centrally associated not only with trying to think through the principles of free speech and defend them, but also trying to think through universities and how they ought to operate more broadly, and try to explain the value of these institutions more generally. And that's definitely an ongoing struggle and challenge. I did, I guess, want to briefly take up the question that David raised about can one be a reformist about current First Amendment law as it relates to government employee speech and academic freedom, or must one be more radical than that? So I'm very sympathetic, I think, to his inclination to think it'd be better if we could start from the ground up, that the doctrinal foundations we have are not great. They're under-conceptualized, or perhaps even on some somewhat wrong footing in various places. And if we made a fresh start at it, perhaps we could do a better job, perhaps not, of trying to make a coherent set of doctrines going forward. And if that's where we find ourselves, is the project that needs to be done, I think there's important thinking that would have to be done as to how to construct it. I don't think, though, and I think it's important that it's not necessary to do that. I think it's possible to work with the tools you have. Certainly circuit courts will feel themselves obliged to work with the tools we have in order to try to do things. And I think there are lots of resources there that one can try to leverage and make advances on. So some of the recent stuff I've been writing has been designed precisely to see what can you do with the materials that are already there, which require, to be sure, some creative reconceptualization in order to flesh out what the future of some of those doctrines ought to be and how they ought to play themselves out. But I think at least hold out the hope that you don't necessarily have to depend on the idea the court's just going to throw it all out and start over. Hopefully you can nudge the court a little more incrementally to embrace these kinds of protections in the way we might like. But the next few years may well be telling as to what the constitutional law looks like on this front, and as a consequence may create either more or less space to develop these arguments going forward. I look forward to doing what I can to try to contribute to those arguments, and then see where we are, reassess, and try to move forward from there as well. One final thing I guess I should say before we turn it over to broader questions, but since we're near the end of the conference as well. As many of you know, I have a heart of stone, and so, but I'm genuinely touched by this conference, and I really sincerely appreciate y'all's willingness to come and everything that's occurred over the course of this. It's been a wonderful day for me. I hope it was tolerable for you, but I really appreciate the engagement with the work and the ideas and with the stories. And so if I don't have another opportunity later, thank you again for coming to this. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Did any of you want to respond? Yeah, David, go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to the last point Keith made in response to my earlier question. I want to say I don't think the alternative to reconciling the general First Amendment law on public employee speech and free speech and academic freedom on campus is starting from scratch. I think there's an existing rich tradition, certainly within the academy, but also within the First Amendment itself, to protect academic freedom for the reasons you and I think all of us believe in, that academic freedom is necessary for the university to fulfill its mission, its function in the production and dissemination of knowledge. I think developing that strand of First Amendment law at the expense of the current First Amendment law of employee free speech jurisdiction is the best way to go. So it's not like a rethinking from scratch, it's a favoring of an element in current law. And just to give an example, I mean, it's obvious, and I know you appreciate this, Keith. You know, in general First Amendment law, as it applies to public employee speech, as most, but perhaps not all of you know, the key initial question is whether the public employee is speaking on a matter of quote unquote public concern. Are professors exercising their rights of academic freedom speaking on matters of public concern? If you read the cases, right, Most, not all, but most courts, these are lower courts, say, yes, if a professor is writing about, teaching about an issue in which the public is interested, like drug policy, as I'm thinking of one case. Just use that as an example. That's a matter of public concern. But if it's only a matter of, and I'm quoting from a case, abstract theory, or something in which the public has no interest or that has no implications for public life beyond the life of scholarship, that's not a matter of public concern, and therefore there's no First Amendment protection for it. Now, Keith would reformulate the concept of public concern to incorporate much of what we call academic expression. I don't really think that can be done convincingly. I think more importantly, one has to say the function of professors in universities is important. It advances concerns that have been recognized in First Amendment theory and need to be protected for that reason, rather than kind of squeezed into the current employee speech doctrine. I could go on, but I won't, but you get the idea. I think it's possible to reformulate existing law rather than kind of reconceptualize it from scratch.
Do you want to respond to that at all, Keith, or no?
If the court is willing to go, if the court is willing to go David's route, I'm all on board. I certainly agree. I think there is a challenge there. I mean, there are multiple sort of steps of the way the government employee speech doctrine works that you'd have to sort of tinker with in order to get you to where you want to be, I think, for academic freedom purposes. And among them is this argument about public concern. And one of the challenges may well be of it requires doing some violence to how public concern gets construed in other contexts, right? And so it really requires, we're going to think about what professors say differently than what we think about other kinds of government employees engaging in other kinds of speech. And it requires thinking about them in the way that you just articulated, really, of thinking about that the public concern here is a public interest in the kind of truth-seeking mission of the university, fundamentally. And it'd be better, right, to just spin that off and just talk about that more directly rather than try to squeeze it into the public concern prong. And it may be the courts are going to be more open to saying, okay, we all just hide this off and talk about it separately rather than try to stretch the existing concept of public concern, which we've used in other contexts, to incorporate into this context as well. And that may be a more sensible approach if courts are willing to do it. It's I think it's a, as you said, the circuit courts are sort of all over the place about how they've thought about this. Some being pretty skeptical of some of these extensions, others less so. So it's hard to know what judges will find more compelling and persuasive about how best to build this out and how much it ought to be extended. And ultimately, I think the Supreme Court ultimately, if it shouldn't continue to sit on the sidelines on this, just given the pressures we're seeing now. The lower courts really do need more guidance about how to think about some of those issues, especially the public concern question, and or matters of merely academic interest covered or not, fundamentally not covered under this kind of rubric.
Great. Any questions? Yeah, John. I think they're bringing you the microphone. There you go.
So I very much appreciate Keith's work on freedom of speech. I wonder whether he might ask him some thoughts for combining it with his thinking about politics, because in some sense one thinks of, we have a regime in the university, and we could talk about freedom of speech abstractly, but we have to talk about the regimes of the universities we have today. And the regime of the university today, certainly with the rise of identitarianism, seems very inhospitable, because one of the facts about truth, it's true regardless of identity. Although, of course, we've heard actually some people say, well, it's my truth or our group's truth, but that's not the traditional Millian understanding of truth. So that's an essential a conflict, and it's not only an abstract conflict, but it's a regime conflict in the sense that we have bureaucracies in the university that are driven by that regime, and not surprisingly aren't going to be really very hospitable to that. So doesn't any serious consideration of how we're going to apply First Amendment principles in the university have to deal with the university institutionally, and the way the modern regime of the university has transformed some of its institutions and indeed some of its denizens?
I think that's right. So when I wrote Speak Freely and tried to talk about the mission of the university, and the mission that I tried to ground it in, of one of truth-seeking and advancing knowledge, was one I posited as being fundamental to what universities are, and then what are the implications of that kind of fundamental commitment. And of course, one point at which one might argue with what the book is trying to do is say, either descriptively or normatively, that in fact is not the mission of the university and the purpose of the university as we understand that. So Mark Graeber has certainly emphasized that descriptively there are plenty of universities that don't seem very committed to that, and they may think that the quality of the football program is more constitutive of the significance of the purpose of the university than the quality of the faculty scholarship and teaching. And so that's certainly a set of challenges. When Princeton assigned the book as part of the pre-read here, it was certainly the case that some of the faculty, I think, in the university thought that normatively that should not be understood as the proper mission and purpose of the university, and that's an ideal of the university they would want to reject. So it was and in part I think it was a somewhat aspirational claim, and partially a claim that I wanted to put forward as being one that I hope was still resonant and persuasive and people could come to. And part of the point as well is to try to get them to realize that there are consequences to rejecting that vision of a university or to letting it erode and slide. And hopefully many people would see those consequences as being unwelcome. But I do think that we're in the midst of a serious debate about that. Part of what I was writing the Speak Freely book, I think, just in the aftermath, maybe it was still ongoing at the time, where the president of the University of Texas was in a real conflict with some members of the board of trustees at the time, and I have a particular interest in the University of Texas. But it was in real conflict with the members of the board of trustees at the time who wanted to really significantly reconceptualize what the university was all about and really, I think, gut it as a research institution and make it into a very different kind of institution as a consequence of that. I think those kinds of pressures are being felt all over the country. And so part of what I wanted to try to write in the book was something that was accessible to the public that tried to explain why the president of the University of Texas was on the right side of that fight, and that's the kind of vision we ought to embrace about universities. And I think you're right. If that's the vision we want to embrace, there are going to be implications about changing and reforming the way universities actually operate in order to bring it more in line with that vision. And that's a political struggle, institutional struggle about making that kind of alignment occur and try to force that through. But it's also an ideological struggle about what kind of universities we want and what they ought to look like. And so I'm not oblivious to the fact that I think this is a highly contested vision. I think I may be oblivious to the fact that this vision is already lost, and it's gone, and there's nothing there to preserve or recuperate. I hope that's not true, because I think if that's not true, then there's a lot of other things that are also lost, and we're just sort of watching the string play out on that. But maybe we'll find out over the course of our careers, and maybe even sooner than the course of our careers, as to how much is left to this vision.
If I could just add a point there, John, the primary preoccupation of the Academic Freedom Alliance and purpose of the Alliance is to defend the rights of individual faculty members whose free speech or other academic freedom rights are under attack or have been violated. We're abstemious about, or careful, I should say, about making policy pronouncements, but we have made a few. And where we feel we should make them is in areas where university policy really does bear upon free speech understood as a necessary condition of the truth-seeking, knowledge-advancing mission of the university. And under Keith's leadership, one of those areas has concerned mandatory DEI statements for hiring and promotion. And we've come out completely 100% against those kinds of statements, precisely because we view them as functioning, whether intentionally or not, as ideological litmus tests, and therefore undermining the conditions that need to be in place for the university to be about the business of seeking truth and advancing knowledge. So at least in our work together corporately there, we're highly cognizant of the concerns that you have.
Can I also add that there's a lot that a determined president or board of trustees enjoying ultimate institutional authority can do about a bureaucracy without raising major academic freedom concerns. In some ways, and I think for a lot of schools, the primary opponent of the university as a truth-seeking institution is really vocationalism. And that fight over vocationalism has been going on for so long that you can go back to presidents speaking early in the 20th century about how universities are too vocational, don't want to, not interested in the disinterested pursuit of the truth. And the trouble there is that trustees are much more likely to buy into that vision of what education should be. They don't find too many identitarians on the board.
But if you look at the actual policies of universities, you'll see who actually has the power. Mm-hmm. And it's not the trustees.
Well, they're not exercising it.
Sandy?
Picking up on Robbie's comment, when I arrived here 49 years ago to teach, one of the major figures, of course, was Richard Rorty. And in 1979, he published Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, the most unforgettable sentence of which was that there is nothing interesting to say about truth. Though, as I think you would agree, Rorty was not a nihilist. He did not deny that there were better and worse arguments. He simply said that after you presented your best case, you got nowhere by saying, and besides, everything I've said is true. And so I really do wonder to what extent that particular view, identified with postmodernism, would continue to be one that I or other people could say, again, to reject a certain facile notion of nihilism or radical skepticism, but simply to say that truth is such an essentially contested concept that we should instead focus on the arguments we make with the presupposition that we're all genuinely trying to get at something that we could recognize kind of as doing our best to get at what is true. That then brings me over to Keith, because I think it's no idle matter that he is shifting from one of the banner liberal arts colleges in the country to what may or may not be the best law school in the country. Well, there is a
In
little
fact,
bit
there's
of
some
debate.
truths you believe in, right? You believe in some truths, right?
But, you know, going back to Socrates and the Gorgias, there's always been an extraordinarily uncertain relationship to truth about legal argument. Lawyers need not believe what they say in the practice of law. They are opportunistic and motivated through and through. Now, ideally, law professors are different, but still our function, unlike I think our function when I was teaching at Princeton, was to teach our students how to make opportunistic arguments, whether or not they believe they are true. And so, in all seriousness, I suppose this picks up on Jonathan's point. How does one put into a single framework the idea of the mission of a great liberal arts university and the mission of even the very best law school in the world?
You have 1 minute.
Shall I
No.
go first? Yeah,
Take,
okay.
take all the time you need.
So,
Keith, you want to go?
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly, and then let you take on the truth and Richard Rorty question. But I was just going to say I have a sudden new commitment to Yale being the very best law school in the world, and to the importance of academic freedom in law schools. And so I must find a way to reconcile a professional school with a commitment to academic freedom. And I take your point, though, that the core of what you're teaching students is different in a professional school in general, and that goes into some degree this vocational training kind of issue as part of it, but also in this question of in what sense is law school about advancing knowledge in the same ways, and is it sort of pushing on frontiers in the same way that helps justify academic freedom in other contexts? I think your point at the end is the right one, and where you'd want to build on, of sort of saying there's a distinction between some of what you're trying to teach students to do and what students need to come out doing and having skills to do, and what it is as a law professor part of the job is, which is still fundamentally to advance knowledge as best you understand it, including best understandings of the nature of the law, et cetera, even if you also want to be able to teach students how to manipulate legal arguments as best you can. And if that component of a law professor's job is going to require the same kinds of logic of academic freedom protections as would be true in a liberal arts college and the like, and is recognizably a very similar kind of concern and set of commitments as what would be true at other parts of the university.
So, Sandy, I agree that Rorty, who was a very important figure when I began my academic career, I agree that Rorty is not a nihilist. He's an ironist. And that was cool. Ironism was cool when Rorty was around, and he was the numero uno ironist. My question is, does ironism of the Rortyian sort provide much of a barrier to nihilism? I don't think so. What's to be said about truth? Here's what I think the important thing to say about it is. It's really worth pursuing. But in pursuing it, we need to recognize that we'll never fully get it. We'll never get it except admixed with some degree of error. We'll never have it perfectly. But when we do get it to the extent that we get it, it's not something that we just hold steady or stagnant. When you've actually got at some truth, what that will do is open up the next set of lines of inquiry. We deepen our understanding of truth. Mill is extremely good on this. Part of the reason we want to get to the next step is because we need to get to that step in order to open up to the future steps. It's the deepening of knowledge, and not just its acquisition as if it were an object or a product that I think we need to be concerned about in our scholarship and in transmitting the kinds of values that I was talking about at the beginning of my remarks to our students. And I think if that's our attitude toward truth, if that's what we think the interesting thing about truth is, then we're going to be committed to it. And you can't be committed to something you don't believe in. We're going to be committed to it. We're going to believe in it. But we're also not going to be dogmatists. In fact, we're going to be the opposite of dogmatists, precisely because of the intellectual humility that comes of our recognition that we're not going to get the truth perfectly, and we'll never get it without error. And we are fallible, and we might have it completely wrong. And we might be wrong again, not only on the minor, superficial, trivial things that we believe, but in our deepest, most cherished, even our identity-forming beliefs. And I think that intellectual humility is the effective barrier against the dogmatism that the old critics of truth were worried about.
I want to add a quick word about Richard Rorty. In about 1990, Luc Menon was then active in the AUP, and he put together a collection of lectures and then essays in a volume called The Future of Academic Freedom. Rorty had an article there, as did Tom Haskell, who Sandy once collaborated with, I believe. And Haskell's view was, if you're an anti-realist, you really can't defend academic freedom. And Rorty disagreed. He said, you can believe that it's impossible to make meaningful truth claims and still be committed to the practice of academic freedom. He said, which means you do not falsify evidence to advance your goals. You protect the right of others to disagree with you. It's the ethical practice of academic freedom that's crucial. You don't necessarily have to believe in truth claims to believe in academic freedom. And I thought that was interesting and, to use a word that's been used before here, plausible.
I don't get it, but
yeah.
Jonathan, were you going to say something about that? If not, I just make one more point, and that's about the importance, when we think about truth, think about knowledge, of understanding it as something that's got to be appropriated. And by that, to understand what I mean by that, let me tell a little story from my own recent experience. Just a couple of years ago, I was co-teaching with Alan Gelzo, the historian, a seminar on the history and purposes of universities, on the question really of the mission, Mark, of universities. And it was a wonderful seminar. We hit the jackpot with students. I mean, of course, all our Princeton students are brilliant, but we really hit the jackpot with this group of 20 students. They were just outstanding. And through the entire, really about 10 weeks into the 12-week semester, that entire time I kept perceiving a real difference of opinion in the group at the level of epistemology. I couldn't quite get my finger on it until the 10th week, and then it came into focus for me. And I was able to crystallize it by asking my students the following question. I put it to the 20 of them. I'm going to give you two options. You tell me which one you choose. In option one, I'm going to give you a fallacious argument for a true proposition about something important. And my argument, though fallacious, is one that you will find persuasive, and as a result of which you will now endorse, you will now believe the true proposition. That's option one. Option two is I'm going to give you a valid argument for the same true proposition about important matter. But this time, my argument, though valid, will not be persuasive to you, and so you won't believe that proposition. Which do you choose? They divided 10-10, right down the middle. The first reaction came from the people who chose option one. They just thought it was obvious. Well, of course, I want to believe the truth. That's the whole reason I'm here. I want to believe the truth. So yeah, give me option one. The truth's what's really important. That was the party that didn't understand the importance of appropriating truth. That is not just understanding that something is the case so you can check the right box on the SAT, but understanding why it's the case, how it's the case, how it's being the case might relate to other things that are the case. It was the people who chose option 2 that got the idea of the importance of appropriating truth. I was able, I think, to persuade most of the people in category 1 who chose option 1 by putting to them the next question. I said, okay, for those of you who've chosen option 1, I'm not going to give you a different option. You can have option 1 if you want it, but it's inefficient. You know, I've got to make an argument, and you've got to think about the argument. The argument's going to be fallacious. You're not going to see the fallacy, but, you know, we're going to go through all that. Instead, I've got the more efficient method. I have right here in my pocket a little pill. I'll give you the pill, and as a result of taking the pill, you will now believe the true proposition. Almost nobody wanted the pill, even though it was more efficient to the same end. No side effects, you know. I think that led them to see there's a problem with choosing option 1, with that understanding of what it means to know or to understand or to learn something. And I think in our teaching, it's important for us to communicate to students that it's not just about believing the true propositions. It's not like catechism class. It's deepening our actual understanding of things. End of sermon.
Great. There were multiple hands. Maybe we can take a few questions in a row if Keith doesn't object, since we only have about 10 minutes or so left, and then I'll let you respond. So, Mark, Jack, and Chris, I saw all your hands. Christopher.
One comment and a comment and question. As I understand, by the way, the Rorty argument, it's mostly an argument that says, first, in thinking about, say, whether we should allow this form of speech on campus, it actually isn't very helpful to think about what is the metaphysical or ontological status of true propositions. And second, it will actually turn out, if we evaluate the quality of the reasoning and then ask, by the way, each person reasoning, what is your position on the metaphysics and ontology of truth, we won't find much of a correlation. In some ways, in a sense, it's actually an empirical argument. The comment with a question, and it's to Keith, and it's a question that sort of connects panels 2 and 3. In Keith's work, model work on American constitutional development, you see a lot of the tools of contemporary American constitutional development. You talk about cycles. You talk about the thickening of political time. You talk about change as a product of ideological contestation and political contestation. Who won the election? What was interesting when I read your book and Howard's book, there was a couple of chapters on political development of universities, and they had a different structure. There was, as you said, an idea. This is fundamentally what a university is about. And we talked about history as, this was the part of the history that got us and seemed to be motivated by the fundamental idea of what a university was about. And then we had a brief potential declension sign, which might be cured by return to the fundamental idea of what a university is about. And I found that a little bit of a tension between what Howard and you write when you self-consciously write on American constitutional development and when you write on freedom of speech and academic freedom in the academy, which is not to disagree with your normative conclusions, but I'm wondering how you reconcile. Or do you feel you're doing two different kinds of developmental stories when you write about the development of the American judiciary and when you write about the development of the American academy?
Great. Do you want to just respond to that, or should we take a few in a row here? How would you like to do it, Keith?
I'm happy to respond.
No, go ahead then.
Which is just, I think you're right. I mean, I think of the Speak Freely book as being a kind of applied normative theory book, and in which you're right, not trying to do this kind of empirical analysis. I think there is a useful kind of political development style analysis to be done of universities. I'm not sure I'm not sure if you would do that the two would completely reconcile easily into being a single work. So I think you're right. There's likely to be tensions between the two kinds of analyses and stories that would emerge out of that. But you're right. I was not wearing that hat when trying to write that book and do some of this work, and I think it would complicate things to try to wear that hat while doing it.
Jack?
This may take us too far down a rabbit hole. Robbie and I are in agreement about claims of truth and knowledge, but that's because both of us have what is not, in fact, a universally accepted view. So in other words, some people believe that there can be truth about factual claims and knowledge about factual claims. Some people believe that there can be truth about moral claims and knowledge about moral claims. Some people believe there can be truth about aesthetic claims and knowledge about aesthetic claims. So that's a box of, 6 positions. But among philosophers, you won't find that most philosophers necessarily will check all the boxes with all 6 of those positions. Some philosophers don't think there's truth about moral claims. Some think there's not knowledge about moral claims and aesthetics, you can see. One of the problems is that when we talk about truth in the university context, we're not just simply talking about matters of fact. We're talking about values. We're talking about morals. We're talking about what's better and what's worse from a moral perspective. And so the problem is, if we're going to have people in a university who can't check all 6 of those boxes, we're going to have to defend them too, even though they don't accept knowledge or truth about moral claims, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not fighting for truth with respect to moral claims. They're fighting for something else.
They are.
Yeah, they are, but I understand. But in other words, the question is, can those people be committed to the defense of academic freedom? I think they have to be. In other words, you and I are talking from a different position. We can check these boxes. Not everybody in philosophy will check those boxes. Great. This is the point. The other thing is that, and this goes back to the review I did of your book, the purpose of a university might be simply the Millian goal of the production of knowledge. Ironic, since when Mill writes, they don't have modern research universities. But the other possible purpose, which is not about football teams, is pedagogy. That is to say, education, and providing a good education. And the question of pedagogy is not the same question as the production of knowledge. They overlap, but they are separate. And so one important issue in academic freedom is the extent to which the pedagogy value would trump the value of knowledge production, or the knowledge production value would trump the pedagogy value. Notice, by the way, I talked about values, and that brings me to the question of whether you want to check the second set of boxes.
And why don't we take, Christopher, your question too, and then Keith will let you respond to them both, if that's all right. Yeah.
So I was wondering if freedom of speech, that phrase from 1791, is really the best lens for thinking about the obligations, especially of states, which of course are strictly bound by the First Amendment, as opposed to the 14th Amendment, which has language of much more general ideas of privileges of citizens. And behind it, equal civil rights for citizens of all political and religious creeds. That's a much richer, fuller view that I think can accommodate a lot more readily, in terms of the history certainly, an idea that we can't have viewpoint discrimination and university responsibilities to promote certain ends. Really fits a lot better with 1868. Given that states do, in fact, have these responsibilities, as opposed to limits on the federal government, which doesn't have any role in these things. So our answers are going to be at Reconstruction rather than the founding as such, all due respect to Madison, our namesake of the program.
I'm open to that. I'd have to do a lot more thinking about whether or not I think that's completely right. I'm not sure I'd want to shed First Amendment, 1787 timeframe logic so quickly, but there may certainly be additional resources associated with the Reconstruction amendments that would be helpful from this perspective, and maybe particularly relevant to thinking about some of these state universities in this context. And certainly if the court ever were to completely overturn the apple cart and say, let's go full originalist in thinking about freedom of speech, right, we'd have to we'd have to explore some other avenues of argument that may well wind up leading us in that direction rather than trying to rely on anything resembling existing doctrine and how it's grounded. On Jack's basic point, and Robbie may have more to add to this. I mean, I think it's yeah. I mean, certainly you're right. I mean, I think it's a complicated conversation. I think I do think that there are some kinds of commitments people have to the nature of knowledge that potentially significantly undermine their commitment to academic freedom, particularly. And we see that with some university faculty who I don't think have any serious, I don't think they have the conceptual resources to have a serious commitment to academic freedom. What they certainly have is a interested position in not having their own freedom restricted, but a broader protection that applies to everyone. I think they have a much harder time developing or even wanting necessarily. And some of that simply, I think, misguided and not well thought through, but some of it is a function, I think, of these different kinds of starting points for how we ought to think about the nature of knowledge and how universities relate to that certainly complicate the discussion. One interesting thing about the book that David referenced and the essays in it is really trying to think through this kind of challenge of can you maintain a practice of academic freedom if you separate it from these kind of foundational commitments that the postmodernists wanted to challenge. And I think part of the difficulty universities find themselves in internally is it's harder to sustain those practices of academic freedom and understand in a coherent way the principled commitments associated with those practices unless you have more foundational starting points. One of the things I've been struggling with lately, in part because of some of the way these state laws are structured and written, is this problem which the AUP raised at the very beginning and has sort of kicked the can down the road and actually having to grapple with, is this question of what counts as indoctrination in university teaching, which the AUP has always said, you shouldn't do that. We should only engage in teaching, not indoctrination. Some of these state laws specifically written in that way of saying you're not allowed to do indoctrination, you're only allowed to do teaching. You know, if y'all have concerns about the interpretation construction distinction, the distinction between teaching and indoctrination, much tougher. And we have not really thought it through very carefully. And I think one of the challenges of undercutting some of these kind of foundational claims about the nature of knowledge is it makes it even tougher to think through, okay, what difference is there really between indoctrination and teaching? And I think there's an awful lot of university faculty right now who not only are not clear about the distinction, not clear they even want to make a distinction and are perfectly content to say, yeah, there's really no distinction between indoctrination and teaching. And if you play that out, I think it goes very badly for universities at the end of the day. But how do you prevent yourself from playing that out given some of the deep conceptual starting points that people have about the nature of knowledge, I think is tricky.
Jack's points, which are very good, reminded me that we really didn't deal with the first part of Sandy's point here, and that had to do with law schools and the mission of law schools by comparison with the mission of liberal arts institutions. Well, the question of the relationship between legal education and liberal arts. Remember Sandy's challenge here. Lawyers make arguments with a view to winning cases. Law professors teach law students how to make arguments to win cases. And this brought me back to my own experience in law school. I went to law school not because I wanted to be a lawyer, but because I wanted to do graduate work in philosophy of law at a place that required a first law degree. I wanted to work with Herbert Hard and Joseph Raz and John Finnis and Ronnie Dworkin at Oxford, which is what I ended up doing. needed a law degree first, so I went up to Harvard. That was in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And even at that point, law schools had begun to move more in the direction of being like liberal arts institutions. There were still members of the faculty who'd gotten tenure on the basis of doing hornbooks and things like that, but they were considered dinosaurs by that point. And law professors didn't seem all that different from, at least the newer hires, didn't seem all that different from the people who taught me as an undergraduate at Swarthmore. But nevertheless, I didn't like it. And it sort of rubbed me the wrong way, precisely because of Sandy's point. People didn't seem to be arguing for truth. They seemed to be arguing for victory. We were being taught to argue for victory. And the most important conversion experience I'd ever had in my life was when I read Plato's Gorgias and got converted from that view. And I remembered who the good guys were and who the bad guys were in Plato's dialogues. And the law professoriate looked to me like the sophists. All right, I don't want to be on that side. And then when I was ready to go onto the job market, although I ended up going on a little earlier than I should have, but by the time that came, I still didn't think of law schools as being like liberal arts institutions. So I didn't want to teach at a law school. I wanted to do philosophy of law in an arts and sciences environment the way it was done at Oxford. So I ended up here. Since then, as Sandy knows, I've had opportunities to teach back at Harvard on a number of occasions. And I now see that law schools have moved even further in the direction of being like liberal arts colleges. The ideals, the approach, much more like liberal arts colleges. If law schools are now much more like liberal arts institutions, then it seems to me that the conditions that need to be in place for the institution to fulfill its mission, given that the mission is going to be much more like a liberal arts institution, including the role of freedom of speech, got to be pretty much the same. So that the distinction between the two begins to really disappear. And law schools will do things like hire people without law degrees who teach philosophy and economics and political science. Now, does that mean that legal education no longer has anything distinctive about it that's related to the training of professionals? I don't know. Do law firms hire people out of law schools because they've been taught professional stuff? I don't know. Or do law firms now hire people who are credentialed by law schools because they figure the people will be pretty smart, and we at the law firms will teach them whatever they actually need to know about the practice of law when we got them there? So what are things like now? How do you guys conceive, got my favorite law professors in the room, how do you guys perceive the mission of your institution?
That's the next conference, Robbie.
It's over. Let's talk.
Yeah. I think we should probably wrap up there. We're a little over time. And we should end by thanking the organizers for this day and especially celebrate Keith on his outstanding career and wish him good luck at Yale.